Oh my god, that was sick!
Get me out of here.
I was gonna say, can I just like throw down the headphones and walk out now?
Show me some nasty.
Okay, you get the idea. So what on earth happened to send both of the Daniels, Danny and Danya, so absolutely nuts and send chat into complete meltdown? Well, to really appreciate the crescendo of this game, we need to build up to it, right? And you can enjoy this in 3 key parts, starting with the opening where Fabi actually comes out on top. So this is the Speed Chess Championship, played online a couple months back or maybe a month back. Let's dive into it. So we see e4 on the board from Magnus, now c5 from Fabi, knight f3, e6, and if you go d4, well, probably Fabi wants to go for some kind of Tamanov variation, but Magnus goes c3, preparing d4 more slowly, and now you can go d5 as black, go into more of a kind of French pawn structure, but Fabi jumps out with the knight, and this is quite a provocative move, because you give white this move, they take the space, but the knight finds a home here, and Fabi's idea is to try and undermine Magnus's centre from afar. So Magnus now develops the bishop. The most common move is actually pawn d4 there. Fabi now goes d6, striking at the centre, and Magnus doesn't take here, because actually when you do this, you're shattering the pawns for a moment, but you've given black the bishop pair. This is a sample line, and there's no development problems now for Fabi. Black's ahead. So instead Magnus strikes with d4. We see captures, the classic Sicilian move. Pawn recaptures. Bishop e7 prepares to castle. Both players now take care of king safety. Magnus brings this rook to the e-file, activating it, and Fabi now plays a slightly inaccurate move. The top one here is knight c6, a more active square, but he brings it to d7, okay, not so bad, and now Magnus takes the opportunity to snap off this pawn, bishop recaptures, and he's freed up this outpost for his knight to develop. But it's a good moment to pause here, because white now has this isolated queen's pawn, or IQP for short. Now that's a long-term weakness, so black would be better in endgames, but short-term you've got outposts for your knights, you've got open lines for the rooks and heavy pieces, and the bishops can flow freely out here, attack the king, and that's often what white's trying to do now, is generate an attack. So Magnus starts with knight c3 here. Now we see Fabi change the pawn structure again. If he goes knight f6 looking to defend this one, well, it's not the most accurate, because Magnus has now got things like bishop g5, knight e5 generating a strong attack. So instead Fabi takes. Now he does let Magnus repair these pawns, but there's a new weakness here, the backwards pawn on c3. So we see b6 now from Fabi, great move, preparing to develop this bishop, bring a rook to target this pawn. And now Magnus gets aggressive, he wants to generate the attack. And again, very instructive. If you kick this knight, you're actually helping it come into e4, attack this bishop, initiative to white, advantage to white. So instead knight f6 played, covers that pawn, covers e4, and after queen f3, Fabi now comes up with a brilliant move, double exclam on chess.com. So you're attacking this rook. Now how many of us here would play rook to b8, right? Just saving that rook. But that is not what Fabi does. He comes up with a much stronger move. Can you guess the move if you want to pause here? So he plays queen c7, leaving an entire rook if Magnus wants to take it, because the trick is you trap the queen. Bishop b7, it's only got one square to escape, but then you check the king, and whether it moves this way or this way, it has to come to a light square. You check, and you pick up the queen next move after the discovered attack. So that's why Magnus doesn't take the rook. He goes bishop d3, eyeing the king. The bishop develops with tempo against the queen. It sidesteps, hits that pawn, and only now does Fabi go h6. Excellent move, because he's forcing back the knight and now forcing this mass liquidation. And this is the point, that when this opening phase is over, it's now Magnus struggling to defend this backwards pawn. And we move to part 2, the middle game. So rook ac8 played, targeting the pawn. Bishop d2 defends, and now we need to apply more pressure to this pawn, and Fabi starts with queen c4, and he could have ideas in the air of b5, bringing this bishop around, something like this, or maybe coming this way, but somehow he needs to apply pressure. So Magnus starts with a4, clamping on any kind of b5 stuff, also looking to open the A file, and now Fabi just goes a bit wrong. He should play something kind of slow, maybe bring the rook to D8, drop the bishop back, look to bring it round, just try and apply pressure from afar on this pawn if he possibly can. But he starts here with king h7, and now Magnus gets queen f3, targeting the f pawn which the king left, so the rook can no longer activate. And after queen d5 from Fabi, he's now moving towards a queen exchange, which doesn't help him. So we see g3 played, the rook comes to c7, preparing to double, king g2, rook f to c8, and now Magnus drops back, and Fabi trades the queens, which he shouldn't do. Queen c4 or b3 was better, because the problem now after the king takes and king g6 is Magnus brings the rook, and actually this pawn isn't so weak because it's so hard to attack it again with this bishop, whereas Magnus has got easy plans now of targeting these pawns here. He's now better. So e5 played by Fabi. He's trying to soften up the centre. Magnus goes a5. Fabi now takes due to that queenside pressure. We see the rook recapture, an exchange here, pawn recaptures, and rook d7. So Fabi's trying to eye that weakened pawn, but the bishop defends, and now Magnus is the one who can start having fun. This is the endgame phase. We're moving towards the crescendo. So bishop e7 opens the eyes of the rook. Now we see h4, and Fabi goes wrong here. He makes a mistake. He should hold solid with something like bishop d8. And if Magnus goes h5 check, well, you can step back with the king, and then okay, you just try and hold this position, stay tight as black. But what we see in the game is Fabi pushing on with this pawn. But the problem now is Magnus can pile up the pressure, and it's impossible to defend. So we see bishop d8 hitting this rook. It gives a check, the bishop blocks, but now check, and you can't hold the pawn, because if you come here with the king, well, you're stepping into this discovery of the bishop, so you can move the rook away with check and then pick up the rook on the next move. So coming back here, after this one, we see the king going to h7, Magnus goes check, the king moves away, and now this rook activates into the game, covers this pawn from the attack. Rook c3 creates a pin on the bishop against the king. The pawn is threatened to drop, so the king steps back, rook d3 comes behind, and now Magnus sets a very sneaky trap with rook to c4. What happens if you take this pawn with the bishop, try and win it? Well, now there's mate in 2. Rook c8 check, and because the king can't move, you have to block, give up the rook, that's mate. So you cannot win that d pawn. So instead Fabi makes room for the king, but he does it in the wrong way. He should play pawn f6. He goes pawn g6, but this is a horrible weakening of these dark squares when white has a dark squared bishop. Magnus checks, the king comes up, and now the second rook slams down, creating all sorts of nasty mating threats using the bishop. So the king runs up the board. But now this rook comes here, great play by Magnus, cutting the e-file. Now look at the time, Magnus is on second, so's Fabi. He keeps running up the board, he doesn't want to get mated. Now Magnus had rook e5 check here, and it actually leads to a forced mate. You then follow up with bishop g5, you force the king back in, won't go in on that whole line, they had seconds. Instead Magnus goes f3, looking to kind of shut this trap on the king, and so Fabi just chops this bishop. It's such a dangerous piece. He needs counterplay, and now he wins a pawn. But here comes this beautiful mate. g4 check, king f4, the rook drops back, covering the king from checks. And now f5 played, but Magnus was anticipating it. He pre-moves, takes here. Pawn recaptures, rook f8, sets up the deadliest, sneakiest trap, and Fabi falls into it. So he goes rook d3. Can you see how Magnus finished the game on the spot? It's mate in 1. So the move to play here is rook e4 check, and that's when we had this reaction.
Oh my god, that was sick! Oh my god, that was nasty!
If you want to see another incredible game between these two players in the same match, then check out the video on screen. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.